Hello everyone. In this video, I will give an overview of the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. It's going to be a pretty brief overview. After the Second World War in 1945, there were two superpowers left in the world, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. The other major international players, Germany, Italy, France, Great Britain, Japan, and China, were weakened by the war and thus unable to challenge Moscow and Washington. So here they are, the Soviet Union and the United States of America after the Second World War. A competition for dominance in the world ensued between the US and the USSR due to possession of nuclear weapons in the United States and, since 1949 in the USSR, neither side wanted to start an open, direct military conflict. Furthermore, by the early 1950s, both the Soviets and the Americans had a hydrogen bomb. Instead of, so to speak, a hot war in the second half of the 1940s, the Cold War began, which implied ideological confrontation, propaganda directed against each other, support by the United States of pro-American, and by the Soviet Union of pro-Soviet forces in various local conflicts, and an arms race. As a result of the Second World War, Eastern Europe came under the rule of communism. This is how Germany was divided. In 1949, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, East Germany, and the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, were proclaimed. The border between the pro-American and pro-Soviet parts of Europe is called the Iron Curtain. Historians often date the beginning of the Cold War in 1946, when the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, used the term Iron Curtain for the first time in his speech. The pro-American countries of Western Europe feared the further advance of the Red Army to the west after World War II, and so they turned to the United States for security guarantees. Together, in 1949, they established NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military political bloc. In response to the admission of West Germany into this alliance in 1955, the USSR established its own military bloc in the same year, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, the Warsaw Pact. In the 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev came to power in the Soviet Union. A thaw began in domestic policy, which included both certain democratization of society as well as some economic experiments, such as the widespread introduction of corn. In foreign policy, Khrushchev continued Stalin's line of strengthening Soviet control over Eastern Europe. In 1956, for example, Khrushchev's troops suppressed an attempt by the Hungarians to create a state more independent of Moscow. Hungary was a part of the communist bloc. In 1959, the revolutionary Fidel Castro, a dictator with a pro-Soviet orientation, came to power in Cuba. The Americans tried to overthrow Castro unsuccessfully in 1961. To protect the friendly regime, Khrushchev placed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962. The Americans immediately learned about this, resulting in President Kennedy's demand that Khrushchev remove the missiles from the island. In this picture, it's these people. So it's these people. I'm sorry. So here's Khrushchev. Here's Kennedy pointing at Fidel Castro, sort of holding on to these Soviet missiles. Khrushchev reached the following agreement with Kennedy. The USSR would take missiles from Cuba in exchange for the removal of American missiles from Turkey, a NATO member country. Thus ended the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Fatigue from Khrushchev experiments and the perception of Khrushchev's decision to withdraw missiles from Cuba as a sign of his weakness contributed to his removal and replacement by Leonid Brezhnev as the head of USSR. So this is Brezhnev. Unlike his predecessor, Brezhnev was unwilling to carry out major reforms in the country. Therefore, his reign is often referred to as stagnation in Soviet history. Similarly to Khrushchev's suppression of the Hungarian uprising, Brezhnev sent Warsaw Pact troops to Czechoslovakia, to Prague in 1968 to crush an attempt to establish democratic socialism in Czechoslovakia. This event, known as the suppression of the Prague Spring, once again damaged the reputation of the Soviet Union in the Western world. At the same time, however, there were mass protests in the United States against American involvement in the Vietnam War. A few years earlier, the United States sent its soldiers en masse to support South Vietnam in the war against the North Vietnamese communists. The United States and its South Vietnamese allies lost this conflict, in part because of the Americans' reluctance to use nuclear weapons against North Vietnam, since this would provoke the USSR and Communist China. In the mid-1970s, all of Vietnam fell under the communist rule. Anti-war protests in the West intensified various movements in the 1960s for women's rights, feminism, and the movement for the rights of African Americans. A prominent voice in the latter movement was Martin Luther King. Many charismatic figures in the United States died in this decade. President John F. Kennedy, actress Marilyn Monroe, and the aforementioned Martin Luther King. However, the moon landing in 1969 boosted the kind of optimism in the American society. And in the 1970s, relations between Western and communist countries were characterized now by a certain rapproachement. This is called detente. This included the recognition on both sides of the post-war borders in Europe, the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two Germanys, and cooperation in space exploration between the East and the West. The end of the rapproachement of detente was marked by the Soviet invasion into Afghanistan in 1979 in order to support the regime of local communists. In protest, the American President Jimmy Carter, along with many Western countries, boycotted the Olympic Games in Moscow in 1980. In Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, sponsored by the United States and Pakistan, fought against the Soviet military and local communists. In 1985, after a series of sudden deaths of elderly and unhealthy Soviet leaders, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union. So that's him. This younger leader understood that the stagnant Soviet system needed to be reformed. Gorbachev launched the full-scale democratization of society called perestroika, which implied in particular the freedom of speech, glasnost. Gorbachev withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan in 1989, signed the Nuclear Arms Reduction Treaty with the United States, and largely abandoned Moscow's control over the communist bloc. The Afghan campaign, which hit the Soviet budget pretty hard, the Chernobyl disaster, which aggravated the population's distrust of the authorities, the opportunity to freely criticize communism under perestroika, and the desire of different peoples within the USSR for independence all contributed to the destabilization of the Soviet Union, and as a result, to its collapse in December of 1991. Instead of the Soviet Union, 15 independent countries appeared or reappeared around this time on the European map. For example, on the 20th of August 1991, Estonia reestablished its independence, and also in the end of August 1991, Ukraine declared independence. Many former Soviet republics have now reoriented themselves to Western international structures. For their part, the member countries of the European Economic Community understood that the admission into their ranks of the post-communist European countries would help strengthen the democracy in these countries. Thus, in 1993, the EEC was transformed into the European Union, not just an economic, but now also a political organization. Many of the post-communist states of Eastern Europe are today members of the EU. The desire of politicians and statesmen to redraw the borders of the former Soviet republics still causes conflicts between politicians and also between countries in Eastern Europe. Today in 2025, this is first and foremost the war in Ukraine. With the collapse of the USSR, the Iron Curtain fell, Germany reunited, and the Cold War ended. The free movement of people from east to west and from west to east contributes to globalization, the spread of ideas and goods that appeared in a particular place, but then quickly became global phenomena. An example is the use of the internet and various technologies. But globalization leads to the spread of both aggressive ideas, the threat of international terrorism that knows no bounds, no borders, and diseases, for example, the coronavirus pandemic in 2020, 2022. Furthermore, the mixture of different cultures and peoples has many worried about the loss of their own identity and has them demanding the strengthening of state borders. Two recent manifestations of this sentiment are Brexit, the UK's exit from the EU, finalized in 2020, as well as calls by the United States President Donald Trump to protect American products on the world market and to stop illegal immigration into the United States. All right, well, that's it for this video. If you haven't seen my previous overviews, please do check them out. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.